My husband was fighting for his life in the ICU when my son texted the family group chat. "This Friday, all 13 of us are staying at your beach house. Get everything ready," I replied. "Your father is on a ventilator. Please postpone the trip." My daughter-in-law answered, "Don't use his illness to ruin our vacation." I stared at the screen, then typed, "Fine." But when they arrived Friday afternoon, every door was locked. This story starts quietly, but it won't leave you unchanged. Before we dive in, drop a comment for me. Have you ever had to set a boundary with family, yes or no? I read your comments more than you think. A quick note, some details here are fictionalized to highlight the lesson, but the message is what I hope stays with you. My husband was fighting for his life in the ICU when my son announced that 13 relatives would be taking over our beach house in 3 days. At 68, I had spent my entire life believing that love meant staying quiet, that keeping the peace was the same as keeping the family together. That Tuesday afternoon in August, sitting alone in the corridor of Spectrum Health Hospital in Grand Rapids, I learned how wrong I had been. My husband Walter, 71, a residential electrician for 40 years before retirement, lay in the ICU with tubes running from his chest. Dr. Brennan, the cardiologist on call, had just finished explaining his condition to me. The doctor spoke with the careful precision of someone who had delivered this news too many times. "The first 48 hours are the most critical," he said, standing in the white corridor that smelled of antiseptic and floor polish. "The family must keep their phones open at all times." I nodded, gripping my phone tighter in my hand. The plastic case felt cold against my palm. Dr. Brennan left me alone in the hallway. Through the small window in the ICU door, I could see Walter's chest rising and falling with the help of a ventilator. The steady beep of the heart monitor echoed faintly through the glass. For the first time in our 43 years of marriage, I was truly alone. I opened the family group chat on my phone to share the news. My fingers shook as I scrolled up to the message I had sent that morning at 8:30, telling everyone that Walter was being rushed to the hospital. I had typed it from the ambulance, my hands trembling then too. That's when I saw it. The tiny read receipt beneath my message. My son Brent, 42, who worked as a car salesman and had perfected the art of making demands sound like favors, had read it at 9:17 that morning. It was now 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Not a single word in reply. Not one question about his father's condition. Not even a simple acknowledgement that he had seen the message. I stared at that timestamp. 9:17 a.m., 7 hours ago. I sat back down in the hard plastic chair. The waiting room was empty except for me and the muted television mounted in the corner playing the evening news. I hadn't eaten since breakfast. The small canvas bag I had managed to grab from home contained one change of clothes and a paperback novel I knew I would never open. The phone stayed silent in my lap for the next several hours. I texted my sister briefly. I called Walter's brother to update him, but from Brent, nothing. What do you call it when your own child reads that his father is in the ICU and doesn't even bother to reply? The hospital gave me a thin blanket around 8 o'clock. A nurse brought me a cup of weak coffee that I didn't drink. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, constant and irritating. Through the window at the end of the corridor, I watched the sunset over Grand Rapids, the sky turning from orange to deep purple to black. I told myself he was busy. I told myself he would call when he had a moment. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. At 11 o'clock that night, my phone finally lit up. Not with a call, not with a text asking about his father. The family group chat exploded with messages. Brent: "This Friday, the whole family of 13 is coming to the beach house for a 2-week vacation. Mom, get everything ready." I blinked at the screen, reading it twice to make sure I understood correctly. Our beach house in New Buffalo, Michigan. The 3-bedroom cottage on Lake Michigan that Walter and I had bought 15 years ago, saved for Maintained, poured our retirement money into fixing up. Before I could even process that, another message appeared. Colleen, Brent's wife, who was 40 and worked in interior design, sent a detailed room allocation list. Who would sleep where? Who was bringing which food? What time everyone would arrive? At the bottom of her message, "Brent and I are taking the master bedroom." She sent the room allocation list as if the house were already hers. I sat there in the empty waiting room, my husband breathing through a machine in the next building, and watched my phone light up with message after message. "Cousin, this needs to bring beach chairs. Nephew, that will bring the dogs." Someone needed to check the propane on the grill. Not one person had asked about Walter. My hands were shaking again, but not from fear this time. I typed carefully, trying to keep my voice gentle, even through text. "Your father is in this ICU. Please postpone it for a few weeks." The reply came within seconds. "Brent, Dad is in the ICU. The doctors are handling it." Then Colleen, Mom, don't use Dad's illness as an excuse to ruin everyone's vacation. I read that line 3 times. Use Dad's illness as an excuse. My phone buzzed again. This time a private message from Brent just to me. Mom, make sure you swing by the beach house to change the bed sheets, then head back to the hospital. I stared at those words on the screen. Swing by to change the sheets, then head back. The beach house was 2.5 hours away from Grand Rapids, 5 hours round trip. My husband was in the ICU. The doctor had told me to keep my phone open at all times because the first 48 hours were critical, and my son wanted me to drive 5 hours to change bed sheets. My husband was breathing through a machine in the next room, and my son wanted me to go change bed sheets. I typed exactly 1 word. Okay. Then I turned off the phone screen and looked out the corridor window. Outside, it was raining lightly in Grand Rapids. Drops streaked down the glass illuminated by the parking lot lights below. The city was quiet at this hour, just the occasional car passing on the street. I sat there in the empty waiting room holding my silent phone, and I started to make a plan. I found the proof that my husband had known all along written in his own shaking hand. The plan was simple. Drive home, pack a bag, get back to the hospital before Walter woke up. But when I walked through the front door of our house in East Grand Rapids that Wednesday morning just after 6, the silence felt different. Heavier. Like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The kitchen smelled like stale coffee. I'd left a mug in the sink 2 days ago before everything fell apart. I went upstairs to grab clean clothes. That's when I saw it. A yellow legal pad on Walter's nightstand, half hidden under his reading glasses. The handwriting was shaky, looping nothing like the tight script he'd used for 40 years as a residential electrician. I picked it up. The first line read, Brent called again, needs $12,000, I told him Friday. My hands went cold. I flipped the page. More entries. Dates. Amounts. March $8,000 for business expansion. May $15,000 medical bills, he said. July $9,000 truck repair. The dates went back months. Years, maybe. All in Walter's hand. All in that same trembling scrawl. Some entries had question marks next to them. Others were circled. One had a single word written in the margin. Again. I sat down on the edge of the bed. My chest felt tight like I'd been laced into a corset 2 sizes too small. Walter had known he'd been keeping track, and he'd never said a word to me. Not once. Not in all the years Brent had been calling, asking, taking. I counted 7 pages of entries, 7 pages of our son bleeding us dry while my husband watched in silence. I folded the legal pad and put it in my purse. Then I called Jim Holbrook. He ran a locksmith business out in New Buffalo near the beach house. I'd met him years ago when we first bought the place and needed new deadbolts. He answered on the second ring. Jim, it's Irene Ward, I said. I need you to change the locks on my beach house today. All of them. He paused. Everything okay, Irene? No, I said, but it will be. I can be there by 9, he said. I'll see you then. The drive to New Buffalo took 1 hour and 20 minutes. I white-knuckled the steering wheel the entire way, replaying every conversation I'd had with Brent over the past 5 years. Every time he'd called asking for help. Every time I'd believed him. The highway stretched out flat and gray ahead of me. I passed a semi-truck hauling furniture, a minivan with Michigan plates, a billboard advertising lakefront property. Jim was already waiting in the driveway when I pulled up. He was in his mid-50s, tanned and wiry, wearing a faded blue work shirt with his company logo stitched above the pocket Holbrook Security Solutions. He gave me a small nod as I got out of the car. Appreciate you coming on short notice, I said. He shrugged. You sounded like you meant it. We went inside. The beach house felt cold despite the August heat. I opened a window while Jim unloaded his toolbox from the truck. He worked quietly pulling out drills, screwdrivers a level. Professional. I watched him pull the old locks off one by one front door, back door side entrance. The sound of the drill echoed through the empty house. Each turn of the screws felt final, irreversible. Changing locks on your own child means something you can't take back. Jim didn't ask questions. He just worked methodical and steady, replacing each lock with a new brass deadbolt. When he finished, he tested each one twice, making sure the tumblers caught cleanly. Then he handed me 3 keys on a silver ring. Anyone else need a copy, he asked. I shook my head. Just me. He packed up his tools and wrote me an invoice on a carbon copy pad. $270. I paid him in cash from my wallet. He gave me a receipt and a business card. You need anything else, you call, he said. I thanked him and locked the door behind him. The new key turned smoothly in the lock. Clean, final. By the time I got back to the hospital in Grand Rapids, it was almost 3 in the afternoon. Walter was still asleep, his breathing steady and slow. The monitors beeped softly. I sat down in the chair by his bed and pulled out my laptop. I opened our bank statements, then I opened the legal pad. One by one, I cross-referenced every entry Walter had written with our account history. Withdrawals, transfers, checks made out to Brent. Some I recognized. Most I didn't. Walter had been careful spacing them out, keeping the amounts just small enough that I wouldn't notice. 1,000 here, 3,000 there, occasionally 10. Never enough to trip an alarm. But I was a seamstress. I knew how to measure. I knew how to count. I knew that fabric didn't lie, and neither did numbers. I added them up. Months became years. Hundreds became thousands. My hands moved across the keyboard like I was stitching a hem, each number a careful stitch, pulling the fabric tighter. I created a spreadsheet. Columns for date amount description, rows that stretched back further than I wanted to look. August 2003, September 2005, January 2012, April 2019, June 2023. 20 years. I hit enter one last time. The number blinked back at me. $230,000. Over 20 years. I looked up at the ceiling and exhaled, not out of surprise, but because I had always known I just never had the courage to look it in the eye. The doorbell camera notification lit up my phone at exactly 3:17 p.m. on Friday afternoon, and I watched my son arrive at a house he could no longer enter. I'd spent 2 more days at the hospital since I found the legal pad, 2 days watching Walter breathe, 2 days adding up 20 years of silence. The number hadn't changed, $230,000, but I had. I was sitting in the waiting room with a cup of cold coffee when my phone buzzed. The notification showed a thumbnail from the new Buffalo doorbell camera. I tapped it. 4 vehicles pulled into the driveway: a white SUV, a gray minivan, a red pickup truck, a black sedan. Doors opened and people spilled out onto the gravel, 13 in total. I counted them. Adults, teenagers, 2 small children, and a golden retriever on a leash. Brent was the first one out of the SUV. He wore sunglasses and a wide smile, carrying a cooler in both hands. Behind him, Colleen climbed out holding a beach bag. They looked relaxed, happy, like they were arriving at a vacation they'd been planning for months. My husband had been in the ICU for 3 days. Brent hadn't visited once. I watched him walk up to the front door. He set the cooler down and punched the code into the keypad. 4 beeps, then a flat buzz. Rejected. He frowned and tried again. Same result. He turned and said something to Colleen. She came over and tried it herself. Another rejection. I could see Brent's mouth moving as he tried the code again. I couldn't hear him, but I could read his confusion perfectly. Behind them, the others started unloading. Suitcases, more coolers, a portable grill, beach chairs. The golden retriever ran circles around a teenager holding its leash. I recognized some of the faces. Colleen's parents, Brent's cousins, a few people I didn't know. Doris, Mercer Walter's mother, climbed slowly out of the minivan. She was 81, thin and frail, wearing a sun hat. Someone handed her a folding chair, and she sat down in the driveway. Brent and Colleen walked around the side of the house, trying the back door, the side entrance. Both locked. They peered through windows, tested door handles. Brent pulled out his phone and made a call. My phone vibrated in my hand. I let it ring. The call went to voicemail. I waited. 30 seconds later, the notification appeared. I tapped it and listened. "Mom, the key codes are all wrong. Send the new one." His voice sounded annoyed. Not worried, not concerned about his father lying in a hospital bed 2.5 hours away, just annoyed that a door wouldn't open. There is a particular ache in watching your own son try to break into a house he never owned. I set the phone down on the small table next to my cold coffee. It vibrated again. Another call. I didn't pick up. Another voicemail. This time it was Colleen. "What kind of game are you playing, Mom? 13 of us are standing out here in the sun. Just send the code." Her voice was sharp, accusing, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I watched the camera feed. Brent was pacing now. The others had stopped unloading and were standing in clusters waiting. One of the teenagers sat down on a suitcase. The dog lay down in the shade. A third call came through. I let it ring. Harold Mercer, Colleen's father, and a man I'd known for 17 years, left the third voicemail accusing me of embarrassing the family. "Are you trying to embarrass the whole family? Your mother-in-law is standing out in the heat. This is ridiculous, Irene. Call us back." I listened to all 3 messages twice. Then I opened the group chat we'd had for years, the one where we coordinated holidays and birthdays and summer plans. I typed one message. "The house is closed. There are hotels available in New Buffalo and South Haven." I attached the names of 2 hotels I'd looked up earlier, Both had vacancies, then I hit send. I watched the camera feed for another minute. Brent pulled out his phone, read the message, showed it to Colleen. She threw her hands up. He started typing something back. I turned off notifications and put the phone face down on the table. Then I stood up and walked down the hall to the ICU. Walter was in room 6. I could see him through the glass window in the door. The ventilator pumped air into his lungs in steady rhythms. His eyes were closed. His hands rested on the white blanket, palms up, fingers slightly curled. A nurse I didn't recognize walked past me with a clipboard. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped. 3 days. My husband had been in the ICU for 3 days. My son hadn't called once to ask how he was. I stood at the window and looked at Walter's face. The face I'd known for 45 years. The face I'd woken up next to every morning since I was 23. The face that had kept secrets written in shaking handwriting on a yellow legal pad. I didn't know who I was protecting more, my husband breathing through a tube in that room, or the woman I had forgotten about for the last 43 years. Perhaps both. Have you ever watched a stranger speak the truth you've been too afraid to say for 43 years? I stood at that window for a long time. The woman I'd forgotten about was the same one who'd walked into a marriage at 23, believing partnership meant equal voices. Somewhere along the way, I'd traded mine for peace. But peace built on silence isn't peace at all. I picked up my phone and opened the doorbell camera app again. The feed was still live. The 13 relatives were still standing in the driveway, clustered in small groups waiting. Brent and Colleen stood near the front door, conferring quietly. The golden retriever had sprawled out under a tree. Then I saw movement from across the street. Howard Ross, our 68-year-old neighbor, and a retired mechanic who had lived across from the beach house longer than we'd owned it, walked over holding a coffee mug. He wore a faded blue t-shirt and gray slippers, like someone who'd just stepped out to check on the commotion. His white hair caught the late afternoon sun. Howard had always been quiet, polite, the kind of neighbor who waved from his porch and kept his lawn trimmed and minded his own business. In 15 years, I'd never heard him raise his voice or involve himself in anyone else's affairs. But something about 13 people standing in a driveway surrounded by suitcases and coolers had apparently crossed a line. Brent saw him coming and walked over, hand already extended like he was greeting an old friend. "Hey there," Brent said. His voice came through the camera microphone clear and friendly. "Do you have a spare key?" Howard stopped a few feet away and took a sip of his coffee. He looked at Brent, then at the crowd behind him, then back at Brent. "Don't have one," Howard said. "The owner changed the locks yesterday." Brent's smile didn't fade. "Right, well, this is our family vacation home. My mom must have forgotten to send us the new code. We're just trying to get in for the weekend." Howard tilted his head slightly. He took another slow sip of coffee. Then he set the mug down on the porch railing and looked Brent directly in the eye. "And no, it isn't," Howard said. His voice was calm, matter of fact. "This is her house. He and she bought it 15 years ago. None of you kids ever chipped in a dime." The silence that followed was absolute. I sat up straighter in the hospital waiting room chair, my hand tightening around the phone. For 15 years, I had been the keeper of uncomfortable silences. And in 8 seconds, a neighbor undid what I had spent a lifetime protecting. Brent's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. Behind him, Colleen's face went pale. A few of the relatives exchanged glances. The teenagers stopped scrolling on their phones. Even the dog lifted its head. Howard didn't wait for a response. He picked up his coffee mug and turned back toward his house. That's when the child spoke. A small boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing a red swim shirt and holding a sand bucket, tugged at Brent's sleeve. His voice carried clearly across the driveway, loud the way children's voices are when they haven't yet learned to whisper uncomfortable questions. "Uncle Brent," he said, "I thought you said this was your house." Brent looked down at the child. His face had gone from confused to frozen. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The boy waited, bucket swinging slightly in his hand, eyes wide and expectant. No answer came. Howard took a final sip of his coffee, set the mug down on his own porch across the street, and disappeared inside without looking back. One of the relatives, a woman I vaguely recognized as Brent's cousin, bent down and whispered something to the child. He nodded and walked away, dragging his bucket behind him. The golden retriever stood up, shook itself, and knocked over one of the coolers with its tail. Ice spilled out across the gravel driveway in a slow cascade. No one moved to pick it up. No one moved at all. Colleen pulled out her phone and walked to the far end of the driveway, her back to the camera. Brent stood where Howard had left him, hands in his pockets, staring at nothing. Children have a gift for asking the questions adults have spent years learning not to voice. The boy's question hung in the air like smoke. I thought you said this was your house. How many people had Brent told that lie to? How many times had he claimed ownership of something that had never been his? How many summers had he invited friends, extended family co-workers to his beach house, while Walter and I paid the mortgage, the taxes, the insurance, the repairs? I sat in the waiting room and replayed that camera clip once, then twice, then a third time. Not because I enjoyed seeing my son humiliated in front of 13 people. Not because I wanted to watch him stand there speechless while a child dismantled his carefully constructed story, but because for the first time in years, someone said out loud what I never had the courage to voice. None of you kids ever chipped in a dime. 8 words. That's all it took. 8 words from a neighbor who valued truth over politeness, spoken in a calm voice over a coffee mug on a Friday afternoon. The answer came at exactly 5:00 p.m., recorded in perfect clarity by a camera they had forgotten existed. I was still sitting in the hospital waiting room when the phone buzzed again, another doorbell camera notification. I tapped it, expecting more of the same Brent-pacing relatives milling around, maybe the beginnings of a retreat to the hotels I'd suggested. Instead, I saw Colleen standing directly in front of the camera, so close her face filled the frame. She was talking to Brent, who stood just off to the side. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway. Everyone else had moved back toward the vehicles, tired and angry, after 2 hours locked out in the heat. Colleen's voice came through the microphone sharp and clear. "Selfish old woman," she said. "Her husband is practically dying and she's still thinking of ways to ruin everyone else's vacation." Brent said something I couldn't make out. Colleen shifted her weight, crossing her arms. "Once Dad passes, she needs to go into an assisted living facility anyway." Brent's voice came through now, louder, closer to the camera. "What's she gonna do living alone in that huge house?" The words landed like stones dropping into still water. I sat completely still. My hand holding the phone didn't shake. My breathing didn't change. I just listened. Behind them, the golden retriever knocked over the cooler again. Ice scattered across the gravel in a wide arc. No one moved to pick it up. Far in the background, I could see Doris Mercer standing alone near the edge of the property, staring out at the lake, completely silent. I replayed the clip. Once, twice, 3 times, making sure I'd heard every word correctly. Then I saved the file. I labeled it Friday_5 PM_yard. I had raised this child, fed him, clothed him, paid for his mistakes for 42 years, and he was planning where to put me once his father was in the ground. I set the phone down and looked at the hallway leading to the ICU. A doctor walked past carrying a tablet. Somewhere a monitor beeped steadily. The smell of antiseptic and floor cleaner hung in the air. 2 hours later, a young ICU nurse named Amy Bradford approached me in the corridor Friday evening, her discomfort visible in the way she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. She was maybe 30, blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, wearing pale blue scrubs. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "I need to let you know someone called earlier asking about your husband." I waited. "They didn't ask about his medical prognosis," she continued. "They asked if he was currently lucid enough to sign legal documentation." My chest tightened. "Who called?" "His son," she said. "He left his name." I sank slowly into the chair behind me. My heart rate didn't spike the way I expected. Instead, it slowed, steadied. The pieces were clicking together now, one after another, like tumblers in a lock. Walter's handwritten note about Colleen asking the lawyer. The phrase, "once Dad passes," captured on camera. And now this. A call to the hospital asking if Walter could sign documents. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't dialed in years. Our family estate attorney, the one who'd handled the beach house closing 15 years ago. I made the call, left a message, asked him to pull everything we had on file. Then I went back to the waiting room and tried to sleep in a chair that wasn't built for it. Saturday morning at 9, Colleen appeared. She wore a navy dress and carried a structured leather handbag. She looked formal, polished, like she was attending a business meeting instead of visiting her father-in-law in the ICU. Her heels clicked against the linoleum floor as she walked toward me. "Mom," she said, pulling a folder from her bag. "Sign this quickly. It's for hospital administration procedures." She held out a pen. I took the papers. I didn't take the pen. The first page was formatted like a legal document. Dense paragraphs, small print. I scanned the header. Durable power of attorney. I flipped to the second page. The third. It gave Brent Ward full authority to manage, sell, and dispose of all real property currently owned by Walter and Irene Ward, including but not limited to the primary residence in East Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the vacation property in New Buffalo, Michigan. I set the papers down on the chair beside me. "I'm not signing this," I said. Colleen's expression shifted. "You don't understand, Mom. Dad is stuck here. Someone needs to manage the assets." "Then I'll manage them," I said. She opened her mouth to argue. That's when head nurse Patricia Kenmore walked past. Patricia Kenmore was a woman in her 50s who had seen enough in 30 years of ICU work to recognize elder abuse when it walked through her corridor. She stopped mid-stride when she saw those papers in my lap. Her eyes moved from the documents to Colleen to me. Colleen stuffed the papers back into her bag, too quickly, too obviously. Mrs. Ward. Nurse Kenmore said, her voice calm and professional. Could you come with me to the nursing station for a moment? I stood and followed her down the hall. Behind me, I heard Colleen's heels clicking in the opposite direction. The nursing station was small, glass-walled, filled with monitors and clipboards. Nurse Kenmore closed the door and gestured for me to sit. What were those papers, she asked. I told her. Power of attorney, forged or coerced, I wasn't sure which, brought by my daughter-in-law while my husband was unconscious 2 rooms away. Walter's handwritten note, the lawyer inquiry, the hospital call, the forged paperwork. This wasn't opportunistic. This was systematic. Nurse Kenmore's jaw tightened. She picked up the phone on her desk. We will notify Adult Protective Services and law enforcement within the hour, she said. I nodded. I thought of my husband lying in that ICU room, completely oblivious to all of this. I hoped he would forgive me for letting it get this far. I had spent 43 years avoiding confrontation, and now I was about to give a sworn statement against my own son. Walter wouldn't need to forgive me. He'd kept that yellow legal pad for a reason. He'd been documenting the same thing I was about to report. The difference was that he'd done it in silence, and I was done with silence. Saturday morning at 10, 2 plainclothes detectives arrived at the hospital. Detective Frank Ridley, a plainclothes investigator in his early 50s with 20 years in financial crimes, introduced himself with the calm professionalism of someone who had heard worse stories than mine. He wore a gray suit and carried a worn leather portfolio. Detective Karen Sheffield. His partner was younger, but carried the same steady demeanor as she opened her notebook and asked me to start from the beginning. We sat in a small conference room off the main corridor. The smell of burnt coffee hung in the air from a pot someone had left on too long. I laid out everything on the table between us. The power of attorney paperwork Colleen had tried to get me to sign. The log from Nurse Amy Bradford documenting Brent's call asking if Walter was lucid enough to sign documents. Walter's yellow legal pad with 20 years of handwritten entries. Detective Ridley photographed each page. Detective Sheffield wrote steadily, filling 3 pages of her notebook with my statement. When I finished, Detective Ridley pulled out his phone. We're going to call your son now, he said. Standard procedure. We need his statement. I nodded. He dialed. Put it on speaker. It rang 4 times before Brent answered. This is Detective Frank Ridley with the Grand Rapids Police Department, Ridley said. We need to ask you some questions regarding a report filed this morning. The silence on the other end stretched for 3 seconds. Then Brent's voice came through higher than usual, rushed. What report? This is a family misunderstanding. My mother is confused. My father just had a heart attack. Everyone is under stress. We need you to come in for questioning, Detective Sheffield said. Her voice was calm, unmoved. Monday morning, 9 a.m., we'll send you the address. I didn't do anything wrong, Brent said. This is ridiculous. Monday morning, Ridley repeated. Then he ended the call. He looked at me. We're opening an official investigation file. 5 minutes after the detectives left, my phone rang. Brent, I answered. What are you doing, Mom? His voice was sharp, panicked. Are you trying to put me in jail? Every mother has that instinct, the one that wants to protect her child even when he's wrong. Mine was still there. It just wasn't louder than the need to protect myself anymore. You called the ICU to ask if your father was awake enough to sign over his house, I said. Answer me that first. Silence, heavy, long. That was just standard legal protection, he said finally. Protection for who? He didn't answer. I hung up. Then I walked back to the waiting room, sat down with my laptop, and opened the spreadsheet I'd started 2 days ago. The afternoon sun came through the window at an angle, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Someone had left a magazine on the chair next to me. A vending machine hummed in the corner. I could hear the faint beeping of monitors from down the hall. I pulled up our bank records. Every statement from the past 20 years. I cross-referenced them against Walter's legal pad, against my own memory, against old emails and text messages I'd saved without knowing why. Line by line, I built the truth. 2011, $34,000. Brent said it was for mortgage payments on a rental property investment. The property never existed. The money went to a failed landscaping business that closed 6 months later. 2014 through 2016, $18,000. He said it was for his daughter's private school tuition. I found the vacation photos later, Rome, Barcelona, Prague. Posted on social media with captions about finally taking the family trip we've been dreaming about. 2017 through 2023. $27,000. Beach house maintenance, he said. Roof repairs, foundation work, new appliances. Walter and I paid every invoice ourselves. I had the receipts. Last year alone, $12,000. Tuition again, he said. His daughter had a full academic scholarship. I called the school once to verify. The registrar congratulated me on raising such a bright student. The money went to a warehouse lease for another failed business venture. I added it all up, every wire transfer, every check, every emergency that wasn't. The total came to the same number I'd calculated days ago, but now I understood it differently. This was never about family love. This was systematic extraction by someone who knew I would never say no. A seamstress learns early you can't hide a bad seam with good thread. The numbers were the bad seam, 23 pages of it. I hit print. The machine in the corner whirred to life, spitting out page after page. I waited until all 23 had stacked in the tray. Then I slid them into a yellow manila envelope I'd bought from the hospital gift shop. I pulled out a black marker and wrote across the front in capital letters, "The Truth." I set it on the table next to my laptop and looked at it for a long time. 23 pages, $230,000, 43 years of marriage, one son who had been lying the entire time. How do you decide whether to send your own child to jail? The family meeting would have to wait. First, I had a choice to make that no mother should ever face. Dr. Gerald Hampton, the hospital administrator who had overseen the Adult Protective Services filing, met me in the corridor Saturday evening with a question I never imagined I would face. "Mrs. Ward," he said, "the APS file has been officially opened. Law enforcement is asking whether you want to pursue criminal charges or keep this civil only." He paused, adjusting his glasses. He was in his early 60s, gray-haired, wearing a white coat over a blue dress shirt. "If you choose criminal prosecution, your son could face immediate arrest." I stood there in the fluorescent-lit hallway. Someone had spilled coffee near the nurse's station, the smell of burnt grounds mixed with antiseptic. A monitor beeped steadily from one of the rooms. I could hear muffled voices from behind closed doors. "How long do I have to decide?" I asked. 24 hours, he said. I nodded. He left. I walked down the hall to the ICU, stood outside the glass window looking in at Walter's bed. The ventilator had been removed 2 days ago. He was breathing on his own now, but still unconscious. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythms. I thought of Brent at 6 years old learning to ride a bicycle in our driveway. He'd crashed into the mailbox and run into my arms with a scraped knee, crying. I'd cleaned the wound, put a bandage on it, told him he was brave. Then I thought of the phrase captured on camera, "Once Dad passes." I had raised him, fed him, loved him his whole life, and now I was deciding whether to let the state put handcuffs on him. I walked into the ICU room, pulled the chair to Walter's bedside, took his hand scarred from 40 years of electrical work, calloused and rough and familiar. I sat there in total silence for 1 hour. Then I stepped out and found Dr. Hampton in his office. "Civil," I said, "for now, but if my son takes one more step, I will change my mind." He wrote something down on a form. "I'll notify the investigators. Before I tell you what Walter's first words were, are you still with me?" Comment A, if you think he asked about his health, or B, if he asked about his son. Add one short reason. Please note the dialogue that follows is recreated for storytelling, but the message is what matters. Sunday morning at 7, I was sitting in the same chair when Walter opened his eyes. The early light came through the blinds in thin stripes. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. His eyes moved slowly, focusing first on the ceiling, then on the IV in his arm, then on me. His voice came out raspy from days of intubation. "Are you okay?" Not "how am I?" Not "where am I?" Not "what happened?" "Are you okay?" I nodded. My throat was too tight to speak. He looked around the room slowly, taking in the monitors, the IV pole, the window. Then he looked back at me. "Did Brent come?" The question was soft, almost hopeful. Nurse Amy Bradford, who knew the entire story, was checking his vitals on the other side of the bed. She looked at me, then at Walter. "He hasn't been by to visit, sir," she said gently. Walter closed his eyes, said nothing, turned his face toward the window. I squeezed his hand tighter. He squeezed back once, then went still. We sat like that for a long time. No words necessary. The heart monitor kept its rhythm. The morning light shifted across the floor. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang. He knew. He'd always known. That's why he'd kept the yellow legal pad. That's why he'd written it all down in shaking handwriting and never shown me. He'd been documenting the same betrayal I was only now beginning to understand. 2 weeks later, Walter was home. He slept soundly in our bedroom in Grand Rapids, while I sat at the kitchen table late at night with my records, my printer, and a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago. I was performing a final audit, going through every line one more time, making sure I hadn't missed anything. That's when I spotted it, an anomaly I'd overlooked before. 2019, $12,000. The note in our record said grandchild tuition. I'd called the school registrar the week before, asked about tuition payments for that year. She'd congratulated me on raising such a bright student. Full merit scholarship, she'd said. Every penny covered. I dug through the bank records. Found the actual destination. Security deposit for Brent's failed warehouse business. The one that folded after 4 months. I added it to the ledger. 24 pages now. 15 copies. One for each person who needed to see the receipts of their own complicity. I printed them all. The machine hummed steadily, spitting out page after page. I stacked them into neat piles, slid each one into a manila folder, labeled them with names. Then I opened the family group chat on my phone, the one with Brent, Colleen, Doris, Harold, and 9 other relatives. I typed one message. Next Saturday, 2 p.m. at my house. I have something to discuss with everyone. I hit send. Brent replied within 30 seconds, finally ready to apologize. I looked at the 15 dossiers stacked on my kitchen table, each one containing 24 pages of itemized proof. Each page showing where the money really went. Each line showing what he'd claimed versus what was true. I didn't reply to his message. They arrived carrying flowers, expecting an apology, and I handed them 24 pages of evidence instead. Saturday afternoon came exactly 1 week after I'd sent the invitation. 1 month after Walter's heart attack. 20 years after the first withdrawal I'd never questioned. I'd set up the backyard like a normal family gathering, folding tables covered with white plastic cloths, sandwiches arranged on platters, potato salad in a ceramic bowl, lemonade in a glass pitcher with ice and lemon slices. The kind of setup we'd done 100 times before for birthdays and holidays and summer cookouts. But the air was different, thick, heavy with something unspoken. 13 relatives arrived between 2 and 2:15. They came through the side gate carrying flowers, casserole dishes, a store-bought pie. They wore the careful expressions of people arriving to witness a formal apology. Some looked uncomfortable, others looked vindicated. Brent arrived first, wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt. He took the seat at the head of the table without asking, the victor claiming his throne. His smile was small but unmistakable. Colleen came next, carrying a bouquet of white roses. She set them on the table in front of my empty chair like an offering. She wore a navy dress and pearls, formal, rehearsed. Doris Mercer Walter's mother took the seat furthest from me. She was 81, frail, wearing a sun hat despite the shade from the oak tree. She didn't look at anyone. Harold Mercer sat beside his wife, arms crossed. My younger sister, Margaret Fleming, 65 and retired from teaching, sat in the middle of the table and had watched our family dynamic with quiet disapproval for years. She caught my eye and gave me the smallest nod. The others filled in around them. Cousins, in-laws, extended family who'd heard Brent's version of events and came to see me eat my words. I walked out of the house carrying a stack of manila folders. I placed one in front of every adult at the table, 15 total, said nothing. The cover page was visible through the clear plastic sleeve. What we have given and what changes starting today. Brent flipped his open first. I watched the color drain from his face as he turned the pages. Colleen opened hers next, scanning quickly, her jaw tightening. For 20 years, I had kept these numbers in separate columns, never adding them up, never looking at the total. Because once you see the whole picture, you can't pretend it's just helping family anymore. I stood at the end of the table and began reading. My voice was level, calm, like I was reading a grocery list. 2011, $34,000. Claimed purpose mortgage on rental property investment. Actual use, failed landscaping business. I paused. No one spoke. 2014 through 2016, $18,000. Claimed purpose, private school tuition. Actual use, family vacations to Rome, Barcelona, and Prague. Brent's hand gripped the edge of the table. 2017 through 2023, $27,000. Claimed purpose, beach house maintenance and repairs. Actual payments made entirely by Walter and myself. Receipts are on page 9. I flipped to the last page. Last year, $12,000. Claimed purpose tuition. Actual circumstance, full academic scholarship. Actual use, warehouse lease for failed business venture. I looked up. Total over 20 years, $230,400. The wind rustled through the oak tree. Someone's lemonade glass sat untouched condensation pooling on the white plastic cloth. The potato salad no one had touched was starting to warm in the afternoon sun. "I am not asking anyone to pay a dime back," I said. "I simply want everyone here to see the actual number." Brent stood up, his chair scraped against the patio stones. "You're treating this family like a business transaction." His voice was loud, defensive. I looked at him. "No," I said. "A business would have sent invoices. I never did." I pulled out my phone, connected it to the Bluetooth speaker I'd set up on the patio table earlier, pulled up an audio file. "There's one more thing," I said. I pressed play. Colleen's voice came through the speaker, crystal clear, recorded by the doorbell camera she'd forgotten existed. Selfish old woman. Her husband is practically dying, and she's still thinking of ways to ruin everyone else's vacation. Then Brent's voice. "Once Dad passes, she needs to go into an assisted living facility anyway. What's she going to do living alone in that huge house?" The recording ended. Total silence. A bird called from somewhere in the neighbor's yard. The ice in the lemonade pitcher cracked and shifted. Harold Mercer's chair creaked as he sat back. My daughter-in-law had planned my institutionalization. My son had calculated my death. And now 13 witnesses had heard it in their own voices. Margaret looked across the table at Brent. Her voice was quiet but firm. "You left that part out when you told us your version of the story." Brent opened his mouth, closed it. No words came. Colleen stood up. I thought she was going to storm off, grab her purse, her flowers, her dignity, and leave through the side gate the way she'd come in. But she didn't move. She just stood there, frozen, her hands at her sides, her face pale, not looking at anyone. For the first time in the 17 years I had known her, Colleen had absolutely no idea what to do. The back door swung open, and my husband stepped into the sunlight for the first time since his heart had stopped him. Colleen was still standing frozen in place when the sound broke through the silence. The creak of hinges, the soft scrape of wood against the threshold. Walter stepped out onto the patio. He leaned on a wooden cane, moving slowly, one deliberate step at a time. He wore the crisp blue button-down shirt I'd ironed that morning. His hair was thinner than it had been 3 weeks ago. His face was gaunter, but his eyes were clear. Everyone at the table froze. Brent bolted upright, his chair scraping against the patio stones. His mouth opened like he was about to say something, about to run to his father, about to play the role of the concerned son. Walter raised one hand, palm out. The gesture was small but absolute. "Sit down," he said. His voice was gravelly from weeks of intubation, but it was clear, unmistakable. Brent sank back into his chair. Walter took 3 more steps, stopped in the middle of the patio. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the white plastic tablecloths. A bird called from somewhere in the oak tree. The ice in the lemonade pitcher had melted completely. He stood there staring at his son, a 71-year-old man looking at the child he'd raised for 42 years, the boy he'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager he'd helped with homework, the man he'd bailed out of failed businesses and bad decisions and endless emergencies for 2 decades. The silence stretched. Then Walter spoke. 7 words, delivered in that same gravelly voice. "When I needed you most, you chose a vacation." No one moved. No one breathed. Brent's face crumpled. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hands gripped the edge of the table like he was trying to hold himself upright. Colleen stared at her plate. Harold stared at the table. Doris sat perfectly still, looking down at her folded hands. Margaret looked away. Not one person met Walter's eye. Walter turned slowly. I stood and walked over to him, taking his arm. He leaned on me heavily as we made our way back toward the house. The door closed behind us with a soft click. I settled him into his chair in the living room, brought him water, made sure he was comfortable. "Do you need anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "Go finish it." I had spent 3 weeks documenting numbers. My husband delivered 7 words. Both were necessary. One proved the exploitation. The other named the betrayal. I walked back outside. The table was exactly as I'd left it. 13 people sitting in various states of shock and silence. Brent had slumped forward, his face in his hands. Colleen had finally sat down, staring at nothing. I took my seat at the end of the table. "There are 4 new rules," I said. My voice was matter-of-fact, level, like I was reading a shopping list. "First, the beach house opens only when both Walter and I mutually agree to invite someone. Second, no more loans without notarized contracts specifying repayment terms. Third, anyone who insults us will never set foot on our properties again. Fourth, the forged power of attorney documentation is with our lawyer. Any further attempt to manipulate legal authority will trigger immediate criminal prosecution." I looked around the table. No one spoke. Brent lifted his head slowly. His eyes were red. "You're choosing property over family," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. I held his gaze. "No," I said. "I am choosing truth over a fake peace." He looked around the table, seeking support, seeking anyone to back him up, to tell me I was being unreasonable, to say he'd been misunderstood. Harold stared at the table. Margaret looked away. Colleen stared at her untouched plate. Doris sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the lake in the distance. Not one relative met his eye. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower droned and stopped. Someone's paper napkin lifted slightly and settled back down. The potato salad sat untouched in its ceramic bowl, warm now, starting to separate. What is the difference between family and entitlement permission? I stood up, pushed my chair back. Before anyone left, I asked one final question. Can anyone at this table name one single time we were asked for our input before you all showed up at the beach house? Silence. Complete silence. I waited, gave them time. Let the question hang in the air like the recordings had hung there minutes earlier. No one spoke. Not Brent, not Colleen, not Harold or Doris or Margaret or any of the 9 other relatives sitting at that table. Not one person could name a single instance where permission had been requested instead of assumed, where we'd been consulted instead of informed, where our property had been treated as ours instead of theirs. I nodded slowly. That is exactly why, I said. I picked up the manila folder from my seat, tucked it under my arm, walked toward the back door without looking back. Behind me, I heard the scrape of chairs, the quiet murmur of voices, the sound of people gathering their things, casserole dishes, flowers, the store-bought pie no one had touched. I didn't turn around. I walked inside, closed the door, and locked it behind me. The silence that followed was not the heavy, suffocating silence of shame, but rather the profound, washing silence of a peace I had not known in 43 long years. No one answered my final question that day. They simply left quietly, one by one, carrying their untouched casserole dishes and wilted supermarket flowers back to their vehicles. I stood perfectly still, watching from the kitchen window as they loaded into their cars and slowly drove away down the gravel driveway. Not one of them looked back at the house. Not one turned around to catch my eye. 2 months later, in the crisp weeks of October, that same extraordinary silence continued to blanket our lives. Brent had cut off all contact entirely. There were no angry phone calls, no passive-aggressive texts, no middle-of-the-night emergencies. Nothing at all. Colleen had taken the extra step of blocking me on every single social media platform, erasing my presence from her digital world completely. A few distant relatives sent generic perfunctory text messages, brief notes saying they hoped I was doing well or that they were thinking of me, but the vast majority of the extended family sent nothing at all. The quiet was nothing short of extraordinary. One chilly afternoon, Harold Mercer called the house. His voice over the receiver was careful, measured, and stripped of its usual demanding authority. "Irene," he said, clearing his throat slightly, "I wanted to let you know that Brent is currently having some rather severe financial difficulties. His business hasn't been good lately. I thought you should be aware of the situation." The heavy implication hung in the air between us, thick and unmistakable. It was the same old unspoken suggestion that had driven our dynamic for decades. "I understand," I replied, keeping my voice steady, "but I have absolutely nothing further to offer him." The telephone line went dead quiet for a long moment. "All right," Harold said finally, his tone flattening. "I just thought you should know." "Thank you for telling me," I said. I was polite yet entirely firm. We hung up without another word. Walter had a routine cardiology checkup with Dr. Brennan that very same week. The news was incredibly positive. His heart function was improving at an impressive rate. Remarkable progress, the doctor called it, looking over the chart with genuine surprise. Walter didn't even need to use his walking cane anymore. His natural color had returned, replacing the ash-gray tint that had worried me for years, and his daily energy was rapidly returning. That evening, the two of us sat out on the front porch, slowly sipping hot tea. For the very first time in decades, my mobile phone sat on the table beside me, completely silent. There were no endless group chat notifications vibrating across the wood. There were no last-minute demands for childcare or hosting duties. There were no frantic requests to wire emergency funds to cover someone else's mistakes. There were no sudden text messages announcing uninvited arrivals or demanding immediate favors. Just beautiful, unadulterated quiet. Walter looked out across the quiet street. The autumn leaves were finally starting to turn, casting brilliant shades of amber and deep red against the fading evening light. "Do you regret it, Irene?" he asked softly, turning his head to look at me. I thought about it seriously. I really thought about everything we had endured to reach this point. "I only regret that I waited so long to do it," I said. Walter nodded his head slowly, a gentle expression of relief softening his face. "Me too." We sat in comfortable silence after that. It was a long, deep silence where no more words were needed between us. For 43 years of marriage and family life, I had mistakenly thought that peace meant the total absence of conflict. I was wrong. I see now that true peace simply means no longer needing to pretend that the conflict doesn't exist in the first place. The very first weekend of October, we packed a small bag and drove up to New Buffalo. It was the first time we had been back to the beach house since the day of the lockout. It was also the first time in many years that we were arriving at the property without hours of exhausting preparation for anyone else. There were no extra bedrooms to painstakingly set up for guests. There were no complicated arrival and pickup times to coordinate at the station. There were no lengthy, expensive grocery lists demanded by text message to fulfill before arrival. It was just the two of us. The Michigan autumn was in full glorious display around the property. Brilliant red and amber leaves completely covered the front yard. The wind blowing off the lake was crisp and cold, carrying the clean scent of water. The shoreline itself was entirely deserted. Walter sat down comfortably on the wooden porch steps, silently watching the rolling waves. He looked completely peaceful. I walked through the interior of the house, slowly moving from room to room. I was checking the space, not out of my old nervous worry, but out of a genuine sense of wonder. The master bedroom was completely empty except for our single suitcase, resting on the luggage rack. The guest closets were entirely free of other people's abandoned gear, stray clothes, and cluttered belongings. The kitchen fridge held only the modest items we had brought for ourselves, some cheese, fresh bread, a single bottle of good wine, and some fresh fruit. It was our own space, finally. Howard Ross stopped by briefly while I was outside. He was busy raking leaves in his own yard across the street and waved warmly when he spotted me standing on the porch. "How are things going over there?" he called out cheerfully. I smiled back at him. It was a genuine, heartfelt smile. "Much better, thank you, Howard." He nodded understandingly and went right back to his raking. Before going back inside the house, I checked the front door lock. It wasn't born out of anxiety or fear anymore. It was just an old habit. I turned the crisp new key in the brand new deadbolt that Jim Holbrook had installed for us months ago. Then standing there, I suddenly realized something profound. It was just a lock. It was a normal piece of hardware exactly like the ones every regular house has. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It wasn't a grand statement of defiance. It was just a lock. Walter's voice called out from the warmth of the kitchen inside. "Are you coming in, Irene? I put the kettle on for us." "Coming." I stepped inside the warm house and gently pulled the heavy door shut behind me. November arrived with cooler temperatures and gray skies. One quiet Sunday afternoon, Walter was dozing lightly in his favorite armchair, a professional football game playing softly on the television in the background. I was sitting at the kitchen table reading a novel when my phone suddenly vibrated against the wood. The screen displayed a name, Doris Mercer. I stared at the name for a long moment, my heart skipping a beat. I took a deep, steadying breath. In that moment, I vividly remembered everything Doris sitting silently in the beach house driveway that fateful Friday afternoon. I remembered her remaining completely silent during the awful audio playback at the backyard family meeting. I remembered her total silence when Brent spoke coldly of putting us into assisted living. She had sat furthest away from everyone else at the table. She had never once defended her grandson's actions, but she had never said a word to support us either. I pressed the button and answered the call. "Hello." Her voice came through the line, hesitant, tentative, and remarkably soft. It held a tone that I had never heard from her in all my years of marriage. "Irene," she said slowly, pausing between her words. "This coming Sunday, would it be all right if I came over to visit you and Walter for a little while?" It wasn't a sudden announcement of her schedule. It wasn't a checklist of things she expected us to provide. It wasn't her telling me that she was coming whether we liked it or not. She was asking. It was a genuine, respectful question. I looked over at Walter, who was still sleeping peacefully in his chair. I looked at the warm afternoon light coming through the clean window, casting long shadows across the floor. I looked at the quiet house and thought about the beautiful life we had finally reclaimed for ourselves. "Of course, Mom," I said softly into the receiver. Sunday between 2 and 5 in the afternoon works very well for us. Walter usually takes his nap right before that time. She cleared her throat on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her emphasis was incredibly careful, deliberate, and measured. "All right, thank you, Irene." The call ended quietly. I set the phone down on the wooden kitchen table and just stared at it for a long time. 17 years. That was exactly how long it had taken for a single person in that entire family to actually ask me for permission instead of just telling me what was going to happen. And the entire shift had started with just 5 simple words, "Would it be all right?" It certainly wasn't an explicit grand apology. I want to be entirely honest about that fact. But it was undeniably the very first time in 17 years that I was asked instead of being informed. And sometimes, when you have lost so much for so long, that exact shift is precisely where the healing begins. Doris came that Sunday, just as she'd promised. She arrived at 2 o'clock, stayed until 4:30, drank tea, and didn't say much. But she showed up. She asked permission. And that mattered more than any apology ever could. December came. I sat in my kitchen on a quiet afternoon watching light snow fall outside the window. Walter was in the living room reading a book, content and peaceful. My tea sat warm in my hands. I thought about the entire year. All of it. From beginning to end. Brent still hadn't reached out. Not a single call, text, or message in 4 months. Detective Ridley had called once in November to confirm the file would stay open, but inactive. The police maintained the civil record. Since there were no further attempts at legal manipulation, I didn't pursue criminal charges. The threat had been enough. Doris visited exactly as scheduled. Harold called once more in November, not about money this time, just to check in. The conversation was brief but civil. I ran into Howard at the grocery store parking lot in early December. He was loading bags into his truck when he saw me. "Everything holding up okay?" he asked. I smiled. "Better than it ever has." He nodded. "Good. That's good." We went our separate ways. The thing is, the lesson I learned this year didn't come from the confrontation with my son. It didn't come from the police investigation, or the dossiers, or the backyard meeting, or even Walter's 7-word judgment. It came from a different moment entirely. I was standing alone in a hospital corridor at 2 o'clock in the morning. Walter was in the ICU fighting for his life. I'd just received a text from Brent telling me to change the bed sheets at the beach house because 13 people were arriving for vacation. And in that moment, I asked myself a question I had never asked before in 43 years of marriage. Have I ever taken care of myself? The answer had been no, not once. Not really. I had taken care of my son, my parents-in-law, extended family, everyone's emergencies, everyone's comfort, everyone's peace, but never my own. If you are listening to this story and you see yourself in it, I need you to understand something: the person you've been protecting by staying silent, it was never them. It was the version of yourself you were too afraid to become. This one time, I finally began taking care of myself, not by being cruel, not by being selfish, but by recognizing that my needs mattered, my peace mattered, my respect mattered just as much as anyone else's. I changed the locks, not to punish my son, but to protect my home. I documented the finances, not to shame him, but to see the truth clearly. I played the recording, not to humiliate him, but to stop pretending words spoken in private didn't reveal intentions. I set boundaries not because I stopped loving my family, but because I finally started loving myself. That hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, that was the moment everything changed. Not the backyard confrontation, not the police report, not even Walter's words. It was me, asking myself one question and finally answering honestly. If you recognize yourself in this story, someone who has given away far too much or stayed silent far too long, I only want to tell you this. Respect never arrives on its own. It doesn't come because you're a good person. It doesn't come because you deserve it. It doesn't come because you've earned it through sacrifice. It has to be demanded, insisted upon, protected. And the most important part? The part I need you to hear: you are never ever too old to start demanding it. I was 68 years old, married for 43 years. I had spent my entire adult life in a pattern of pleasing, accommodating, silencing myself to keep the peace. And I still changed. I still drew boundaries. I still reclaimed my dignity. I still chose myself. For 43 years, I thought self-care meant bubble baths and quiet evenings. I was wrong. Self-care means looking someone in the eye and saying, no, not anymore. It is never too late. Not at 68, not at 70, not at 80, not ever. As long as you are breathing, you have the right to demand respect, to set boundaries, to say no, to choose peace over fake harmony, to prioritize your own well-being without apology. The people who truly love you will adjust. The people who don't, well, their absence will teach you something too. I looked out the window. The snow was falling steadily now, covering the front yard in a clean white blanket. The street was quiet. The neighborhood was peaceful. Walter turned another page of his book. The sound was soft, familiar, comforting. My tea was still warm in my hands. Somewhere out there, my son was living his life without me, Maybe one day he would reach out. Maybe he wouldn't. I had made my peace with both possibilities. Doris would visit again next month. She'd already asked, not announced, asked if the second Sunday in January would work. Margaret called every week now. Just to talk, just to check in. The beach house sat quiet and locked in New Buffalo, waiting for the next time Walter and I decided to visit. On our terms, at our invitation. And me? I sat in my kitchen, 68 years old, watching snowfall, holding warm tea, learning what peace actually felt like. The snow fell steadily outside my window. Walter turned another page of his book. My tea was still warm in my hands. And for the first time in 43 years, the quiet wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the presence of peace. When you spend over 4 decades living exclusively for everyone else, choosing yourself feels less like a sudden triumphant victory and more like an arduous, slow awakening. It forces you to completely re-examine every single compromise you ever made in the sacred name of love. You realize that true strength is not found in perpetual endurance, nor is it found in carrying the emotional weight of an entire family at the absolute expense of your own spirit. True strength begins with an honest admission of your own deep exhaustion. It begins when you decide that your existence is not a luxury to be maintained only after everyone else has been satisfied, but a fundamental life that requires protection, care, and absolute boundaries. You learn that people who are used to your silence will naturally interpret your new voice as aggression, but their discomfort is merely a reflection of their own dependency on your self-sacrifice. You learn to stop apologizing for wanting to breathe. You learn that peace is not merely the absence of conflict, but the solid presence of self-respect. It is the deep comfort of knowing that your home is safe, your mind is quiet, and your life is finally being lived on your own terms. Choosing yourself means understanding that love without boundaries is ultimately just a slow form of self-destruction. And most importantly, you learn that it is never too late to reclaim your dignity, to redefine your relationships, and to discover what it truly means to be at peace with who you are. The transformation from an accommodator to an individual with firm agency requires a profound shift in perspective. For 43 years, the definition of being a good mother and a dedicated wife was tied directly to how much suffering could be silently absorbed. When that illusion shatters in a cold hospital hallway, the truth becomes unavoidable. True responsibility does not mean shielding adult children from the consequences of their cruel choices, nor does it mean maintaining a facade of family harmony when the foundation is entirely rotten with entitlement. By demanding respect, you do not isolate yourself from the world. Rather, you filtered out the parasites who only valued you for what you could provide. The quiet kitchen, the warm tea, and the steady falling of the winter snow are not symbols of loneliness, but the earned rewards of an authentic life. The silence becomes beautiful because it is no longer forced upon you by fear, but chosen by you as a sanctuary for your soul. And to you listening to my story, remember this: you are never too old to choose yourself. Don't make my mistake. I waited 43 years before I realized that family drama doesn't get better when you stay silent. It gets worse. I spent decades believing that keeping the peace meant never asking myself, have I ever taken care of myself? The answer was no, not once. Peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of respect, and respect has to be demanded, not hoped for. If you're living through something similar, whether it's with a son, a daughter, or anyone who treats you like an ATM instead of a person, I want you to know boundaries aren't cruelty, they're survival. Revenge stories with mom at the center aren't about getting even, they're about getting free. I believe God put me through this to teach me that self-care isn't selfish. It means looking someone in the eye and saying, no, not anymore. And it's never too late to start. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. These revenge stories with mom standing up for herself aren't just entertainment, they're lessons. Have you ever had to choose between family harmony and your own dignity? Your story might help someone else. Please share this with anyone facing family drama and subscribe to Silent Revenge with Auntie May for more stories like this. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time means everything to me. Just a reminder, some details in this story have been adapted for storytelling purposes, but the lesson, the truth about boundaries and self-respect is real and important.